Class 10 Biology, Chapter 2, Control and Coordination, Video number 1. Students, in this video first, I'll be giving you a brief introduction of the chapter. Then I'll be discussing about how the nervous system controls and coordinates various activities. So here I'll be discussing about the structure of neuron, the receptors and their functions, the process of generation and transmission of nerve impulses, and the synapse. Students, as you all know that the most important criteria to be living is movement, right? This was told to you in the first chapter, right? So movement is the most important criteria to be living, and movement can either be growth dependent or it may be growth independent. It may be growth dependent or it may be growth independent. An example of a growth dependent movement is what is seen in plants. When you sow a seed in soil, after some days the seeds germinate, and as time passes a small seedling comes out of the soil. Due to germination of the seed, the shoot of the plant will grow towards light, whereas the root of it is going to penetrate deep into the soil. So this is also a movement seen in the plant, but this movement that you see is dependent upon growth. If growth will not occur, then such a kind of movement will not be seen. Though such a type of movement that you see is a very slow movement. Plants also show growth independent movement, right? For example, you take touch me not plant. In case of touch me not plant, when the leaves of the touch me not plant is touched, you'll find that the leaflets close and the entire leaf droop. This is an example of a growth independent movement. Or in case of animals, as seen in these pictures, the children are playing in the park, or the children responding to the teachers by raising their hands. These are also examples of movement. Or a cat running, that is also an example of a movement. Or a cow sitting and chewing the cud. These are different examples of growth independent movements. Now, why do we consider movement as a most important criteria to decide whether the thing is living or not? Is because the movements are the responses. They are the responses shown by organisms to the changes that occur in surroundings. Students, as you all know that the most important criteria to be living is movement, right? This was told to you in the first chapter, right? So movement is the most important criteria to be living, and movement can either be growth dependent or it may be growth independent. It may be growth dependent or it may be growth independent. An example of a growth dependent movement is what is seen in plants. When you sow a seed in soil, after some days the seeds germinate, and as time passes a small seedling comes out of the soil. Due to germination of the seed, the shoot of the plant will grow towards light, whereas the root of it is going to penetrate deep into the soil. So this is also a movement seen in the plant, but this movement that you see is dependent upon growth. If growth will not occur, then such a kind of movement will not be seen. Though such a type of movement that you see is a very slow movement. Plants also show growth independent movement, right? For example, you take touch me not plant. In case of touch me not plant, when the leaves of the touch me not plant is touched, you'll find that the leaflets close and the entire leaf droop. This is an example of a growth independent movement. Or in case of animals, as seen in these pictures, the children are playing in the park, or the children responding to the teachers by raising their hands. These are also examples of movement. Or a cat running, that is also an example of a movement. Or a cow sitting and chewing the cud. These are different examples of growth independent movements. Now, why do we consider movement as a most important criteria to decide whether the thing is living or not? Is because the movements are the responses. They are the responses shown by organisms to the changes that occur in surrounding. Right? Now, the movements are always shown in a controlled and coordinated manner. Now, what does it mean? Any kind of movement that is shown by an organism, it depends upon the environment that triggers the movement or the response. For example, when you are there in the field, you there, you will run, you will shout at each other, and you'll play and do all kinds of activity. But then the moment you come to the classroom, the responses that are shown by you, the kind of movement that are shown by you in the classroom will not be the same as that how you behave in the ground. When you are there in the field, there if you have to pass any information to your friend, how will you pass it? By shouting, by telling loudly. But the same thing when if you are there in the classroom and if suppose you have to pass a message to your friend who is sitting nearby, and if the class teacher is there in the classroom, then definitely you will whisper and thus you will pass the message. So the type of movement that is shown by the organism or by the individual, it depends upon the environment that triggers the kind that particular movement. And all the movements that are shown by organisms, they are always shown in a controlled and coordinated manner. Right? Now this control and coordination in case of animals is done by two systems. One is the neuromuscular system and other is the hormonal system. Right? Now about this you'll be learning in detail in the next slides to come. Whereas in case of plants, plants do not have any nervous system. They don't have any nervous system. And so in case of plants, all the activities or the various kinds of movements that are seen in case of plants, they are controlled by plant hormones, which in detail we'll be discussing in this particular chapter. Now let us study how the nervous system controls and coordinates various activities in human beings. Before we start, let us learn some of the definitions. There are certain terms that you need to know. First is, what is nervous system? The nervous system consists of, or you can say it is a system of nervous organs, nerves and neurons which controls and coordinates various activities through nerve impulses. Okay, next is, what are nerve impulses? Nerve impulses or electrical impulses, both are the same. The nerve impulses are self-propagated electric current. Nerve impulses are self-propagated electric current that flows along or that travels along the surface of the nerve fiber for passage of information. We say nerve impulse as self-propagated, means what? Once the nerve impulse or the electric current, because nerve impulse moves like how current flows through the wires, in the same way the impulses move through the nerve fiber. So they are self-propagated, that is they move on their own. Once the nerve impulse is generated, it's going to move on its own. Self-propagated electric current that travels along the surface of nerve fiber for passage of information. Now, next important term that you need to know is, what is a stimulus? A stimulus is any change in the external or internal environment that makes an organism to react. Like if suppose you touch a hot iron plate, how will you react? You will be withdrawing your hand. Or if suppose in the classroom, if you are asked to write some notes, the moment the teacher says so, you will be responding by taking out your copy and then you take out your pen and start writing. So in these examples that I have shown, like heat or sound, they are the stimulus. So stimulus is defined as any change in the external or internal environment that makes an organism to react or respond. Now, response. Response is the reaction that is shown by an organism towards a stimulus, and responses or reactions, as just now discussed, these responses or reactions are shown in forms of movements. Just now I have discussed. So when the organism moves, it becomes clear that the organism is responding to the stimulus. Now, stimulus has to be received by organism, and this stimulus, the different types of stimulus, they are received by receptors. And what are receptors? These are special tips or specialized tips of some nerve cells that are present in our sense organs, which detect the information of stimulus from our environment. Okay, so that these are what are called as the receptors. Okay, so receptors, they are the specialized tips of nerve cells present in our sense organs, like your eyes, your nose, your ears. The skin has different receptors, and those receptors are nothing but the specialized tips of certain nerve cells which receive the stimulus. They are the ones that detect the information from the environment, okay, and then generate an electric impulse or a nerve impulse. Then the effectors, the organs which are the muscles, glands, or any other organ that receives information from the motor neurons and show appropriate response. So as we discuss, I'll be discussing about these terms once again, and then these terms will become very clear. Like for now, the effectors, they are the organs like muscles or glands. Like suppose if there is something lying, a delicious cake lying on the table, the sight and smell of the cake will be the stimulus that will be received by the receptors. And how are you going to respond? The muscles of your legs will move towards they will contract and relax, and that will help you to move towards the cake. Then you lift the cake, that will be again because of the muscles of the hands, and then you put it in your mouth, and the saliva and the digestive juices will be released by the glands to do their work. So here the muscles and the glands, they are the effectors because they are the ones that receive information by neurons called as the motor neurons, about which you will be learning later. And so these muscles or the glands, on receiving information, they show a appropriate response. As I have just now stated that the nervous system comprises of nervous organs, nerves and neurons that controls and coordinates various activities through nerve impulses. So now let us study about the neurons and how nerve impulses are generated and transmitted. Have a look at this diagram of neuron, right? In class 9 you had studied about this also. So each neuron, as you have studied, has got three important parts. There is a cell body which is also called as cyton. You've got dendrites and the axon. Now the cell body is that part of the neuron which contains cytoplasm and nucleus. So the nucleus and abundance of cytoplasm is present in the cell body. Arising from the cell body are cytoplasmic processes. Okay, these cytoplasmic processes are of two types. The short branched cytoplasmic process that you see, these are called as dendrites, and the long cytoplasmic process, which is the longest part of a neuron that makes a neuron the longest cells of the body, that is called as the axon, right? Now the dendrites are the part of the neurons which receives information, or the stimulus or information from the environment is received by the dendrites, and then after the nerve impulse is generated, the impulse or the information will be transmitted towards the cell body, and from the cell body this information is taken away from the cell body through the axon. The axon at the end terminates into branch terminals which are called as nerve endings, or these are also referred to as axon terminals, right? And as you can see here, the axon terminals at the end, they are knobbed. So these knobbed endings of the axon terminals, they are referred to as synaptic knobs, which I'll be telling you in the next slides to come. So just have a briefing of what I have discussed just now. The neurons contain three important parts. They are the dendrites, which receives the stimulus and transmit it towards the cell body. The cell body, that is the part of the neuron which contains nucleus and abundance of cytoplasm. Then the axon, the long cytoplasmic process of the neuron which transmits impulse away from the cell body. And then finally the nerve ending or axon terminals. The axon terminates into branched nerve endings that may end over the muscle fiber, glands or other structures. These axon terminals that you see, this can either end over a muscle fiber, or it may end over a gland, or it can also form a synapse with the dendrite tip of next neuron, about which I will be discussing. Okay. And one more very important thing about the axon terminal is that the axon terminals are often knobbed. Okay, they are knob like, and these knob like structures which are present at the end of the axon terminals, these knob like structures that you see, these are called as synaptic knobs. They are called as a synaptic knobs, right? Now the pathway for electric impulse. How does the electric impulse move? So first the stimulus is first received by the dendrites of the neuron, then it is passed to the cell body, then from the cell body it is taken by the axon and it runs along the axon, and finally it reaches the axon terminal. Now neurons are of three types. Just have a look at this diagram. There are three types of neurons. They are the sensory neurons, the relay neurons and the motor neurons. Now let's see what is the main difference between these three types of neurons. A sensory neuron is a neuron which takes the information from the receptor to the central nervous system. It will be carrying information from receptor, that is from the sense organs, to your central nervous system, which comprises of brain or spinal cord. Then there is another kind of neuron which is called as the motor neuron, right? A motor neuron is a one which will be taking message from the central nervous system to the effector organ. Just have a look at this diagram. It is the message will be taken from the central nervous system to the effector organ, which can either be a muscle or a gland or any other structure. So that is done by the motor neuron. And there are also some relay neurons. These relay neurons are the neurons which pick information from sensory neuron and pass it to the motor neuron. These relay neurons are present only in the central nervous system, about which I will be telling you later. That these, for now you should know that central nervous system is a part of the nervous system that comprises of brain and the spinal cord, right? So these relay neurons, they are present only in the central nervous system, and their work is to pick the information from sensory neuron and pass it to the motor neuron. So these are the three types of neurons. The neurons can either be sensory neurons, can be relay neurons, or they may be motor neurons. So as you all know that every living organism responds to the changes that occur in the environment. So the information from the environment has to be picked by the organism, and that is picked by the organism or the animals by means of receptors. And what are receptors? The receptors are the specialized tips of some nerve cells that are present in your sense organs, and these are the receptors that detects the information from the environment, that is, they are the ones which receive the stimulus, right? The stimulus of smell will be received first by the receptors, then it is taken by the neurons to the central nervous system, that is the brain, which analyzes the message, and then you become aware of the same. So the information from the environment is picked up by the receptors, and receptors are nothing but they are special nerve cells which detect the information from the environment. Now these receptors, they are present in the sense organs. And what are your sense organs? The nose, tongue, ears, eyes and the skin. They are the sense organs, and different types of receptors are present in different sense organs. For example, your nose. Your nose has got olfactory receptors which is to detect the smell. So when you are holding some flower and trying to smell it, the chemicals or this fragrance, they pass into your nose, and these are first detected by the receptors which are present in the olfactory epithelium that lines. So there is epithelium that lines your nasal cavity. So that is, those receptors detect the same, convert this information into an electric impulse, and then this information in the form of electric impulse or electric current is then conveyed to your brain, and the brain then analyzes the message, and then you get the fragrance of it. So before you analyze what is it, the information is first picked up by the receptors, and the receptors that are present in your nose, they are the olfactory receptors. In your tongue you have got gustatory receptors, and the gustatory receptors role is to it is to detect flavors of food. It is present in the taste buds of your tongue, and that is, it detects the flavor. Similarly, in your eyes you have got the photoreceptors. You must have learned about the rods and the cones that are present in the retina. So they are the photoreceptors. And in your ears you got the phonoreceptors or the auditory receptors. You have learned in class 9 that there is ears, they help in hearing and also in maintaining the balance. So for hearing you got phonoreceptors or the auditory receptors, and for maintaining the balance there is statoreceptors present in the ears, right? Your skin has got thermoreceptors. So most important, according to what is given in your NCRT, the two receptors that you need to remember, one is the olfactory receptors which is present in the nose and it detects smell, and the other is the gustatory receptors which is present in the taste buds of tongue to detect flavor. Okay, so that's about the receptors, which are the specialized tips of the nerve cells that are present in our sense organs, and their role is to detect the information, that is, they are the ones which receive stimulus and then convert the stimulus into an electric current, which is then, or electric impulse, that is then passed to the sensory neuron. So now let us study how the nerve impulses are generated and then transmitted from one neuron to other neuron. Now, as just now I have told you that the information is first received by the dendrite tips. So when the dendrite tips receives the information, at the dendrite tip, the point where the information is received, there a chemical reaction occurs. So a chemical reaction occurs at the point of reception. Because of this chemical reaction, an electric current is generated. Now this electric current that is generated is the nerve impulse. So this nerve impulse, once it is generated, I said you nerve impulses are self-propagated. So once the electric impulse is generated, this impulse then travels all along the dendrite, reaches the cyton, and from the cyton it moves along the surface of the axon, and finally it reaches the axon terminal. As Just now I had told you that the axon terminals may end over either a muscle fiber, or if it is a motor neuron, it will be ending over a muscle fiber or a gland, or the axon terminal of one neuron may form synapse. It may form synapse with the dendrite tip of the next neuron. So now let us see what is a synapse. A synapse is a small gap containing communication junction. Just have a closer look at this part of the neuron. You find that the axon terminal is not in direct contact with the dendrite tip of the next neuron, rather there is a small gap present, and this gap containing communication junction is what is called as the synapse. So when this electric impulse reaches the axon terminal, because there is a gap in case of electric currents that you have learned that the current flows till the circuit is complete, but if there is a gap in the circuit, then the current will not flow. But here the impulse from one neuron has to move to the other, and so for that it has to pass through the gap. So how does this impulse pass through the gap? Let us see. Now once the impulse reaches the axon terminal, this electric impulse will cause a release of some chemicals. Okay, the axon terminals releases some chemicals, and these chemicals that are released, they are called as neurotransmitters. They are called as neurotransmitters. So these chemicals that are released, they will be passing, because current can't pass through the gap. The chemicals that are released, they pass through the gap, that is through the synapse, and then they go and bind to the dendrite tip of the next neuron, right? If there is a dendrite neuron, then it will be binding to the dendrite tip of the next neuron. If there is a muscle fiber, then those chemicals will be binding to the surface of the muscle fiber. The muscle fiber or the dendrite tip will have receptors for those chemicals. The moment these chemicals bind to the dendrite tips of the next neuron, this again acts like a stimulus, and again the same chemical reaction as I had told you in the beginning will occur, and again an electric impulse will be generated, which will again move towards the cell body, and then again will be taken all along the surface of the axon to the end. Okay, so this is how the nerve impulses are generated and they are transmitted, right? So here if you have a closer look at this diagram gives the, here in this diagram, a magnified view of this synapse is shown. As just now I had told you that synapse, it is a gap containing communication junction. So if suppose this gap is magnified and seen, it looks like this, what is shown in this diagram, right? So here this is the axon terminal. I said you when I was discussing about the structure of this neuron, I had told you that the axon terminal is knob like, and that knobs are called as a synaptic knob. So this is the axon terminal, and what you find that these synaptic knobs of the axon terminal, they have sac like structures. These sac like structures, they are called as synaptic vesicles, right? Now these synaptic vesicles, they contain those chemicals which I was talking to you just now, right? So these chemicals, they are the ones which are going to help in transmission of impulse to the next neuron. So here you have got this synaptic knob, and what you find over here is the dendrite tip of the next neuron, and you find a small gap also. So when the nerve impulse, just now I had told you, when the nerve impulse reaches the axon terminal, these synaptic knob vesicles that you find, these sac like structures that are present because of the electric impulse, these vesicles, they start moving towards the end of the synaptic knobs, and when they reach the end of the synaptic knob. These vesicles, when they reach to the end, they fuse with the membrane of the synaptic knob and release all these chemicals in the gap. The chemicals are released in the gaps. The chemicals then cross the gap because current can't pass, but the chemicals cross and then they bind to the receptors. You can see here that the dendrite tips, they have receptors, right? They have receptors. So these chemicals bind to the receptors, and the moment the chemicals, they bind to the receptors, the moment these chemicals, they bind to the receptors present on the dendrite tip, a similar kind of electric impulse is created, which was created when the information was received. So same, binding will act like a stimulus, a chemical change again will happen over here at the dendrite tip, and this chemical change will then again generate an electric impulse and the process will continue. So these are the steps of transmission of nerve impulse. The first step is information is detected by the dendrite tips of the nerve cell. The information acquired at the dendrite tip sets off the chemical reaction that generates an electric current. Then the electric impulse travels from dendrite tip to the cell body and then along the axon to its end. At the end, the at the end of the axon, the impulse will set off the release of some chemicals. These chemicals cross the gap, okay, or the synapse, and once they cross the gap, they will bind to the dendrite tip of the next neuron and start a similar electric impulse in the dendrite tip of the next neuron. Or these impulses or these chemicals that are present, if suppose the neuron is ending over a muscle fiber or a gland, then these chemicals will bind to the receptors which are present on the surface of the muscle cell or the gland, and because of that, when the chemicals bind to these membranes of the muscle cells or the gland, this will result in the action, that is, the muscle will either contract, and if it is a gland, it is going to secrete some secretion. So a synapse is a gap containing communication junction where the axon terminal of one neuron lies very close to the dendrite tip of the next neuron, which was told to you just now. And if such a kind of synapse is present between the motor neuron or the axon terminal of the motor neuron and the muscle fiber, then that is called as a neuromuscular junction. So this diagram that you are seeing, this diagram, this shows the neuromuscular junction, where you find that the synaptic knobs of the axon terminals are embedded in the membranes of the muscle fiber, and the membranes of the muscle fiber, they have the receptors. So as just now stated, that the electric impulse will finally reach the axon terminal, and then the synaptic vesicles which are present in the axon terminal, they move towards the membrane of the synaptic knob, and then on reaching to the end, these synaptic vesicles release the chemical in the gap. So chemicals are released. These chemicals then bind to the receptors which are present in the membranes of the muscle fiber, right? And once this they bind, the muscle fiber gets excited, and that excitation of the muscle fiber, when the muscle fiber gets excited, the muscle fiber will contract. So this is how the muscle fiber contracts and the movement is brought. Remember one thing, that the transmission of nerve impulse is always unidirectional. Means what? It means that the nerve impulses will always move from dendrite to cyton, cyton to axon, axon to axon terminal, and then from axon terminal to the dendrite tip of the next neuron. It is never the reverse way, that is from dendrite tip to the axon and then axon terminal, then to the axon, and then the other way. It's never this. It's always from dendrite to axon, axon terminal, and then to the dendrite tip of the next neuron. And why is it so? It is because the axon terminals they are the ones, the axon terminals are the ones which release chemicals. The axon terminals or the nerve endings, they release chemicals, and these chemicals cross the synapse, and after crossing the synapse they bind to the receptors which are present in the dendrite tip of the next neuron. Okay, so since the axon terminals release chemicals and the dendrite tips, they have receptors for receiving the chemicals, the transmission of nerve impulse is always unidirectional. On the basis of the video that you have watched, here are some questions that you have to do in your bio copies. The first question is, what are receptors? Give examples. Next, how are nerve impulses transmitted? What is a synapse? How are impulses transmitted across a synapse? Why is the transmission of nerve impulse unidirectional? And draw a label diagram of a neuron or nerve cell.